In a small county in eastern Ohio, sometime in the early 1920s, a group of Amish farmers in Holmes County were doing something with their worst fields that the emerging chemical fertilizer industry would spend the next 100 years quietly hoping you would forget. They were taking clay, hard, compacted, pale, gray clay that most farmers in that era had already written off as useless ground. Clay so dense it cracked like old pottery in a dry summer and turned to sticky gray paste after rain. And within a single growing season, those same farmers were pulling harvests from that clay that made their English neighbors stop their wagons on the road to stare. This video is about that method. Not the sanitized, dumbed-down version. The real one. The one that has been practiced in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in Holmes County, Ohio, and in the Amish settlements of LaGrange County, Indiana, for over 200 years, without a single bag of synthetic fertilizer, without a single soil amendment from a corporate catalog, and without a single penny paid to the companies that today charge you $60, $80, sometimes over $100 for a bag of granules that does a fraction of what this method does naturally. Here is the question that will hang over everything you are about to learn. How does dead clay, with almost no organic matter and almost no biological life, become rich, dark, crumbling earth in 30 days? The answer is not magic. It is not folklore. It is verifiable chemistry and biology that your grandfather understood intuitively and that a very profitable industry needed you to stop understanding. By the end of this video, you will have the answer in full, and you will understand exactly why it was buried. Before we get into the mechanism, let me set the scene, because this story deserves to be understood in context. Picture Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in the late 1800s. The farms there are running on human and animal labor, on observation accumulated over generations, and on a knowledge base carried from Switzerland and southern Germany by the first Anabaptist settlers who arrived in Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. These were not primitive farmers. They were farmers who had spent 2 centuries in Europe learning how to coax food from difficult ground, and when they arrived in Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana, they brought that knowledge with them. Locked in their communities, untouched by outside commerce, it survived intact. Donald Craybill, one of the most respected scholars of Amish life in America, documented in his research on Lancaster County communities that Amish agricultural practices represent a form of what he called intentional conservatism, meaning these communities do not resist modern technology out of ignorance. They resist it out of a deliberate choice to maintain practices they know work against pressure from outside systems they do not trust. That framing matters for what you are about to learn. The fields in question, those pale clay fields that look like the kind of ground you give up on, are in fact the starting point of the whole story. Because here is something most people do not know. Clay soil, the kind that frustrates every gardener who has ever tried to dig it, is not poor in minerals. Quite the opposite. Clay particles are some of the most mineral-rich material in the Earth's crust. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, iron. It is all there, locked inside a structure that roots cannot access, that water cannot easily penetrate, and that biological organisms struggle to inhabit. The Amish understood this instinctively. Clay is not empty. Clay is locked. And what they developed was a key. If you have a garden right now, and you have been told by a bag of fertilizer or a box store employee that your clay soil needs to be replaced or chemically treated before it can grow anything worth eating, drop the number 47 inches in the comments below, or better yet, the state you are gardening in. Because I want to know how many of you are out there dealing with the exact same ground that the Amish turned into their most productive fields. Let's see the map. The method begins with something so simple and so available that the first time you hear it described, you will feel a small flash of something between disbelief and recognition. That feeling is important. Hold on to it, because that feeling is the gap between what you were sold and what actually works. Amish farmers in Holmes County, according to accounts documented by agricultural historians studying pre-industrial American farming practices, built what can only be described as a managed thermal compost pile, but with a specific layering formula that incorporated native clay directly into the composting process from the first day. Not after the compost was finished, not as a separate step. From day one, clay was layered into the pile itself. This is the part the modern soil amendment industry glossed over when they began selling you amendments as separate products in separate bags. Here is the mechanism, and this is where the chemistry becomes genuinely interesting. When you layer fresh organic material, green plant matter, kitchen scraps, animal manure, with clay, something specific happens at the particle level. As the organic material decomposes, it releases humic acids. These acids are mildly acidic compounds produced by microbial activity, and they have a remarkable property. They chemically bind to clay particles and break apart the tight lattice structure that keeps the minerals locked inside. The technical term for this is cation exchange, and while the phrase sounds like something from a university laboratory, the phenomenon is as old as soil itself. Humic acids unlock the mineral vault. Clay particles, once treated this way, become some of the most nutritionally dense growing medium on Earth. The Amish were not reading chemistry textbooks. They were watching what happened when they mixed certain materials with clay over a season, and they encoded what they observed into practice. That is how agricultural knowledge worked for 10,000 years, before someone decided it needed to come in a bag with a brand name on it. But there is a part of this they really did not want you to know: the timing. The 30-day figure in this method is not approximate. It is specific, and it is tied to the thermal cycle of a properly built compost pile. When you build the pile correctly, with the right ratio of carbon to nitrogen material, the interior temperature climbs rapidly to between 130 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit within the first 72 hours. At that temperature, two things happen simultaneously. Pathogenic bacteria and weed seeds are destroyed, and the microbial population, the beneficial organisms doing the actual decomposition work, reaches peak activity. This peak activity phase, maintained through proper moisture and occasional turning, lasts approximately 30 days before the pile begins to cool and stabilize. That 30-day window is not a marketing claim. It is the biological reality of thermophilic decomposition documented in soil science literature going back to the 1950s. Now here is where the historical record gets uncomfortable for some very powerful people. In 1945, when American soldiers came home from World War II, the chemical plants that had been producing nitrogen compounds for explosives and nerve agents needed a new market. The nitrogen chemistry that made TNT and sarin also made ammonium nitrate fertilizer. The pivot from weapons production to agricultural chemicals happened with remarkable speed, and with the active support of the United States Department of Agriculture, which beginning in the late 1940s began promoting synthetic nitrogen fertilizer as the modern solution to American food production. By 1950, nitrogen fertilizer sales in the United States were growing at rates that had no precedent in agricultural history. The companies driving that growth, including what was then Monsanto Chemical, American Cyanamid, and others, had every financial incentive to make sure American farmers forgot that soil biology could do what synthetic nitrogen did for free using materials that were already on the farm. Not because there was a meeting in a boardroom where someone decided to destroy traditional knowledge, but because the profit motive works slowly and systemically, the same way erosion works, one policy at a time, one agricultural extension bulletin at a time. One generation of farmers who went to land-grant universities where the curriculum was shaped by corporate research funding. Earl Butz, who served as Secretary of Agriculture under Presidents Nixon and Ford in the 1970s, famously told American farmers to get big or get out, encouraging them to plow fence row to fence row, take out loans, buy more equipment, plant more corn and soybeans, and embrace the full suite of chemical inputs that the agribusiness industry was selling. Butz was not a villain in a movie. He was a product of a system that had already spent 20 years building the infrastructure that made small-scale, biology-based farming look obsolete. The Amish watched all of this from their farms in Lancaster County and Holmes County and LaGrange County, and they kept doing what they had always done. And this is the moment everything changed for most of rural America. The moment worth stopping on because it explains the gap between what you were taught about your soil and what an Amish farmer of 73 years old in Millersburg, Ohio, knows without thinking twice. If you have not subscribed yet, do it now before we get into the final part of this. Every week, this channel goes deep on methods like this one, the practices, the industry buried, the wisdom Amish communities kept alive, and the specific knowledge most Americans gave up without realizing it was happening. This is not a gardening channel. It is a record of what got lost and how to get it back. By the mid-1950s, the agricultural extension system that had once documented and supported diverse farming practices across America was almost entirely oriented around chemical inputs. The library of traditional soil management knowledge that had been built over 2 centuries was not burned, it was simply not transmitted. When the grandfathers of that generation retired, the knowledge retired with them because the next generation was being taught a different system, a purchased system, a system with quarterly sales cycles and shelf space at the co-op. John Hostetler, the ethnographer who spent decades studying Amish communities and whose work remains among the most rigorously documented accounts of Amish agricultural life, noted that Amish farmers maintained a relationship with their soil that he described as fundamentally observational and generational, meaning the knowledge was not written down, it was demonstrated. Father to son, neighbor to neighbor, across a community that had no incentive to buy what it could make. When the rest of rural America stopped demonstrating and started purchasing, the knowledge chain broke. That broken chain is why your grandfather in 1955 knew how to read his soil by looking at it, by feeling it between his fingers, by noticing which weeds grew in which corners of the field and what that told him about mineral availability. And why in 2025, most of us reach for a soil test kit from Amazon and wait for a number that tells us which bag to buy next. The Amish clay method is the clearest possible demonstration of what that broken chain cost us, because it turns the most discouraging soil problem most American gardeners face, dense, airless, mineral-locked clay, into a solved problem using nothing but materials that are already on your property or available for free. We are talking about organic waste from your kitchen, yard trimmings, a source of nitrogen which on any farm means animal manure and on any suburban homestead means grass clippings or coffee grounds, and the clay itself. The clay is not the problem you add amendments to fix. The clay is the raw material you build the amendment from. The layering ratio that Amish farmers in Lancaster County have used for generations follows what modern soil scientists would recognize as a rough carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 25:1, which is the sweet spot for thermophilic composting. 2 to 3 parts dry carbon material, straw, dried leaves, wood chips, to 1 part green nitrogen material, fresh plant waste, manure, kitchen scraps, and then, at every 3rd layer, a thin spread of raw clay, not processed clay, not pottery clay from a store, the same gray, heavy, discouraging clay you dug out of your garden bed. Spread thin, maybe a 1/2 inch, tamped lightly so it contacts the organic layers above and below it. As the pile heats, the clay particles are physically broken apart by the expansion and contraction of the thermal cycle. Freeze and thaw does this in nature over the course of a winter. A hot compost pile does it in 30 days. The humic acids released by decomposition penetrate the cracked clay particles and perform the cation exchange described earlier, freeing the minerals locked inside the clay lattice. What comes out of a properly managed pile after 30 days is a dark, crumbling, sweet-smelling amendment that combines the mineral richness of clay with the biological richness of finished compost. It is not metaphor to call it black gold. It is a materially accurate description. A 73-year-old Amish farmer in Holmes County who has worked the same fields his grandfather broke ground on in the early 1900s would tell you, if you asked him the right way, that his soil gets better every decade instead of worse. That is not a claim any salesman of synthetic fertilizer can honestly make. Synthetic nitrogen feeds the plant. It does not build the soil. In fact, the extensive use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer has been documented by soil scientists at land-grant universities, including the University of Illinois, which published research in the 1990s showing that long-term synthetic nitrogen application reduces the organic matter content of agricultural soil over time by accelerating the oxidation of existing organic carbon. In plain language, synthetic fertilizer extracts fertility from the soil while giving you a temporary boost in yield. The Amish method does the opposite. It deposits fertility into the soil while also growing your crop. And here is what the industry spent decades hoping you would never figure out. The cost comparison is not even close. A bag of granular fertilizer that might cover 1,000 square feet costs you $40 to $60 and disappears after one season, leaving your soil slightly more depleted than it was before. The Amish clay method uses materials that cost nothing, takes 30 days of passive decomposition with minimal labor, and leaves your soil measurably richer every single time you use it. There is no subscription. There is no dependency. There is no next season where you have to buy a different product because the last one stopped working. The reason this method was buried is not because it does not work. It is because it works so completely that it removes you from the purchasing cycle permanently. And a customer who has permanently left the purchasing cycle is the industry's worst outcome. What does it say about us, about this country, that we took knowledge developed over 2 centuries by communities who understood that the land was not a resource to be mined, but a relationship to be maintained, and we traded it for a bag of pellets and a quarterly invoice? What does it say that the most productive agricultural communities in America today, per acre, are often the Amish settlements that never made that trade? There is a question worth carrying into your next growing season. When was the last time your garden soil got measurably better? Not just produced a crop, but actually improved, deepened, darkened, became more alive from one year to the next? If the answer is, I'm not sure, or it hasn't, you already know what you have been missing. The buccal opened at the start of this video asked how dead clay becomes black gold in 30 days. The answer is thermal decomposition, humic acid chemistry, and 200 years of observation by communities that had no reason to sell you anything. Clay is not your enemy. Clay is a mineral bank with a locked door, and the Amish found the key before the chemical industry was even born. Recovering this method is not a romantic gesture toward the past. It is a practical act of soil sovereignty. When you build a clay compost pile, the way an Amish farmer in Holmes County builds one, you stop asking permission from a corporation to grow your food. You stop paying for fertility that your own property already contains. You stop participating in a system that was designed not to serve your garden, but to extract money from it season after season until the soil is too depleted to argue back. That is what the Amish never gave up. Not a technique, a relationship. A relationship with the ground under their feet that produces the same results in 2025 that it produced in 1825, because the chemistry of soil biology did not change when Monsanto Incorporated and Earl Butz told America to get big or get out. The clay did not get the memo, and now, neither will you. Leave a comment below and tell us what your grandfather grew in his garden, or what your family lost when the supermarket replaced the root cellar. Tell us whether you have clay soil and whether you have ever been told it was hopeless. We read every single one, and those comments matter because they are the record of what real American gardeners still remember and still want back. If this video opens something up for you, give it a like. Share